Let's start in the Metro, and we'll go from the bottom to the top to start in that division. The New Jersey Devils. You got quite a few Devils on your list, Frank. You just put out your top 50 list this morning. What do you make of New Jersey Devils? What do you think happens?
I think they're open for anything. I think they're willing to consider a lot of different things. The highest profile guy that teams have been interested in has been Damon Severson. I think stylistically, when you have a guy like Dougie Hamilton, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to try and, fill out your group with another similar type player, even though he doesn't do it as well as Dougie Hamilton. And Dougie Hamilton chews up a lot of space on your cap. Pavel Zacha has been interesting. He's a center. They want him or are trying to play him on the wing on a team that has some pretty gifted centers. I haven't heard anything about PK Subban, pending unrestricted free agent. As of 10 days ago, they hadn't received any calls on Subban. And I think there's an outside chance, for some other players on their list that have a little bit of term. Andreas Janssen is one.
I saw you.
Jonas Siegenthaler is another one that has gotten some interest as well. 1.125 for next season. And the other thing, Mackenzie Blackwood is on the list. They've, I guess, sort of soured on him with his play and his injuries. They're not certain that he can be their guy moving forward. That's why he's on the board. And to that end, they're looking for a goalie. Both maybe to finish off this season, even though 21-year-old Nico Dawes has stepped in and played quite admirably. I don't think they want to shoulder him with that much burden to end the season. Blackwood's trending closer to being healthy after his heel injury, and they're looking for someone that could be their goaltender of the future as well. So lots of different irons in the fire for Tom Fitzgerald.
I look at the Devils and Subban's contract. It's just, to me, it's almost untradeable at that high of a cap hit. Even if you eat half, it's still 4.5. So I don't see that happening. But I think of those guys, every team's always looking for right defenseman. The problem is Severson doesn't really fit the bill, Frank, as far as, because he's not like that big, heavy, just a good defender type of guy. And so, but I think Pavel Zacha, I'm going to say this. I think if the Devils make a move, I think Pavel Zacha is the guy who's going.
Okay.
Now we move up the ranks in the Metro to the Philadelphia Flyers. This one seems pretty easy, Frank. I think it's Captain Obvious will say Claude Giroux. I know your latest, it's still nothing confirmed to Florida, but a lot of the arrows seem to point to Florida. So what would be the reason why he doesn't end up in Florida? Is there another team you think that can swoop in here?
Well, yeah, I think it's a 2-horse race with the Colorado Avalanche. I still ultimately think he's going to Florida. I think at the end of the day, that's his preferred or slightly preferred destination. There's been lots of smoke there. Both organizations on late Thursday night had poured cold water on anything being in place. He didn't accompany the Flyers to Ottawa, is not playing this weekend, won't play on Sunday at home against the Islanders either. A nice little symmetry or numerology to close out his career. Exactly 1,000 games, exactly 90 points. He's the premier forward available. Since 2010, only 3 players in the NHL have more points than Claude Giroux, and it's a pretty elite company to be in. It's Patrick Kane, Sidney Crosby, and Alex Ovechkin. That's it. That's the list. Claude Giroux is 4th. And why it might not get done with Florida is I think the Flyers have been really underwhelmed with the package. And I think what they're trying to do is curry up a market where Colorado perhaps ups the ante, and the Avs have something that the Panthers don't. And that's a first-round pick in the next 2 years. The Avs have one in 2023. The Panthers have traded their 22 and 23 first-round picks for Sam Reinhart and Ben Sherratt. And I think the Flyers have been underwhelmed by what the Panthers have put on the table. And the problem for the Flyers is it's hard to really generate any more leverage, because if indeed Claude Giroux has picked the Florida Panthers as his top or only destination, which I don't believe to be the case in terms of only, I think he'd be willing to go to Colorado. That puts the Flyers in a tough spot. And I think that's, really the reason why Florida either isn't able to or hasn't offered up more. The names that have been talked about, Owen Tippett, who sat out Thursday's game in the AHL to protect the asset. Mackie Samoskevich, their 2021 first round pick, or 2022. He's a forward at Michigan. So are those pieces alone enough to get it done? I don't think so.
Yeah, it's kind of, I look at Florida and I'm like, geez, like Claude Giroux obviously would help, but how much would he help? That's my ultimate question. They got a pretty deep team, right? So they're good in face-offs, right? So I'd be kind of curious on where he would fit in. But ultimately, I think it's going to end up there, Frank, because I think if you're Philly, you've kind of gone this far. Like to not trade Claude Giroux wouldn't really help your organization unless you're going to re-sign him, right? That to me is going to be the interesting one, because you talked about it earlier. You play chicken and then you decide what's going to happen. The other player who I do think will move in Philly is Justin Braun. He's a right shot defenseman. He fits all the markers. You know, his cap hit is easy to obtain for any team. I think there's a few teams out west. I know Edmonton has had some interest in it, but
he's really struggled this season.
Yeah, and if they get a right defenseman, then they got to take one of the right defensemen out of the lineup, unless they trade, one of the right defensemen, which would probably be they're not trading Cody Ceci and they're not trading Evan Bouchard. So
yeah, ideally they'd get a left shot guy, right?
Yes, 100% a left shot guy.
So I think with Braun, what I believe is ultimately going to be the price is a third round pick that has conditions on it. If you advance a certain number of rounds, it becomes a second, something like that. That's the type of neighborhood we're talking about with Braun.
Yeah, and might even be tied in the player that he's got to play so many games. Usually that's kind of tied into it as well. If he plays half the games in the playoffs for your team. The New York Islanders, Frank, Cal Clutterbuck's the obvious name. He's a UFA. I was told that, he's not interested, at least right now. Now that can obviously change in 72 hours, but neither of the goaltenders were somebody he wanted to move, and he didn't want to move any of his top four defensemen, and Pelech and Pulak and Dobson. That's what, he's been telling the opposition. We'll see. So if that's the case, I don't see a lot of players on New York that are that attractive, because they got a lot of guys with term.
Yeah, I could see the Islanders doing next to nothing.
Yeah.
I don't see a big shakeup coming. Teams I've talked to say Semyon Varlamov is not available. Lots of guys on term. I think they're going to try and run it back.
Yeah. So I don't know, man. They got to get some. They got to be able to move the puck up better. That's limited their team. I don't think there's any question about that. And obviously they got some veteran guys who just haven't played well. So yeah, maybe lose a veteran. Maybe he just stands pat, and we'll see. Like, I'm sure he'd like to trade Cal Clutterbuck, right? But Clutterbuck's a 3. Like, even if they're eating half, that's still a pretty big cap hit for a bottom. Probably a fourth line player at this time. But I could see Cal Clutterbuck still being moved, Frank, because teams like that style of player in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The Columbus Blue Jackets have some real interesting names. What are you hearing on I know Max Domey's on your list. He's actually been quite productive. If you look at his points per minute this season, he hasn't played a ton, but he's actually been fairly productive. He's got a little snarl in his game. He seems like the obvious guy to go. Is there any team that you see as a fit for Domey? Because I have one.
That's the only thing I haven't been able to come up with, is who is in the mix for Max Domey. I think the Blue Jackets are aggressively trying to move him. I'd be surprised if he doesn't move before 3 p.m. on Monday. I think he's the perfect playoff pickup, especially maybe for the price. I mean, you take a look at how he's produced in 13 minutes this season. It's right up there with his 72-point season from a number of years back when you correlate it all out. I think the Blue Jackets have been underwhelmed with his play, and it's been disappointing because they gave up a lot to get him in Josh Anderson, but that's where they stand. Max Domey is not coming back to Columbus. He's been pretty motivated, it looks like, in the last 4 games, 4 points in 4 games to maybe get out. But he's not the only interesting name in Columbus. Jack Roslovic's name has been out there for a bit. He hasn't necessarily been a fit. Teams really like the potential from Jack Roslovic, but they feel like he goes 2 weeks without seeing him, that, he fails to show up. I think one sneaky name that's a possibility that didn't make my board is Vladislav Gavrikov.
Okay.
I think the Blue Jackets have been watching the market very closely and see the prices that are being paid for Ben Sherratt and say, well, if that's what they can get for Ben Sherratt as a pending UFA, what can we get for a much younger and better Gavrikov, who has one more year left on his deal at $2.8 million? I don't think they're trying to trade him, but if someone came and knocked their socks off, I think they'd do it. They haven't been able to get anything for Jonas Corposalo. I think they're looking at a mid to late round pick at this point. He's not coming back. They're not re-signing him. They might as well recoup something. And then the other wild card is Alexander Texier. He's been injured, and on top of that has been dealing with some family stuff and has been placed on a leave of absence. I think it's really unlikely that he goes, but I know that they were getting some calls on him not too long ago.
Yeah. I'll save it for the other team who I think is going to acquire Max Domey later on in the division. So the Washington Capitals, Frank, their GM came out and said, you know what, I'm not sure that we should do anything with this group. Now that might, that could be GM talk. He might be legit or not, but they're starting to get healthy again. And like Marc-Andre Fleury to Washington, still, Frank, for months you and I have talked about this. It still seems to make the most sense if they want to do it, right? I guess it would depend on the cost, depends on, does Fleury at the end of the day, I've been told, well, Ken Holland said it yesterday. He still hasn't, Fleury said not to Edmonton, not interested in going there. So if he wants to get traded, and you look, I don't see Vegas being an option. So that leaves Toronto and that leaves Washington. And then Fleury, would pick maybe which one he thinks is a better fit. I think it might be Washington, to be honest.
I don't see it. And it's all going to come down to price on Fleury. And we can talk more about Fleury when we get to Chicago. But I think Washington has tried to improve their team in other ways. They were in deep on Calle Jarnkrok. I know Peter Laviolette, their coach, was a big fan when he had him in Nashville. That's really been their one key area on their team aside from goaltending. They have the defensive depth this year. They feel like their third line has left them short, has failed them a bit. And Jarnkrok would have been absolutely perfect for that, in addition to his versatility. I'm not sold that they go out and get a goalie. I think they're going to try, but I would think that Washington on the list of possibilities is probably either at the bottom or is the bottom for Fleury.
Okay. Then you move up. Now you get into the top three teams in that division. The New York Rangers, they've already made a move. They add Vetrano. They still have a lot of cap space. I think the second most of any of the playoff contending teams behind Nashville. You talk about a goaltender, Frank. Georgiev, he would seem to me the most likely guy to go. I'm just curious because his numbers suggest to me he plays better when he plays more frequent. And behind Shesterkin, he's just not playing much. And when he was playing more frequently, his numbers were better. His numbers don't look great. Now, opposing teams are probably going to say, yeah, that's great, but let's look at what his numbers are right now. I'm fascinated to think what the Rangers could get for him in a deal. And like the name I don't rule out the Edmonton Oilers for Georgiev because he fits more what Ken Holland's outwardly stated, that if he's going to make a trade, he would like to make one for somebody with term, other than like a depth defenseman. And I know it might be a reach, but I still think that's the guy. If I think a team that could use him, when I look at their big picture, Georgiev's the guy.
I could be wrong. I don't think the Oilers are that high on Georgiev. I think there's a lot of things to unpack with Georgiev. I think teams have been really concerned about his body language, about his commitment. I guess they feel like he's been, or outwardly been, selfish. I think there's been talk about what he's like in the Rangers dressing room that has hurt his trade stock. The Rangers are actively trying to move him. What can they get for him? It's probably a late round pick at this point. Like, I'm thinking fourth. If Alex Nedeljkovic went for a third, Georgiev hasn't been as good, and there's baggage, and he's not coming back. So the Rangers don't have a lot of leverage.
Vegas
is a really strong possibility, I think.
Yeah. They need a goalie because, well, you
Bad.
reported Robin Lehner, like he's very unlikely.
Which Leonard also denied again. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if you saw the tweets, but Leonard says that my report is inaccurate, and that's fine. I stand by. I know exactly, who I'm talking to and what the injury is. He says he'll be back soon. Pete DeBoer said no one that's injured for the Golden Knights is not in the quote near future. That was at his availability on Thursday. Anyway, we'll park that for the Vegas talk.
The Pittsburgh Penguins.
By the way, New York Rangers, oddly enough, wanted to mention they are one of the teams that's interested in Phil Kessel.
Makes sense.
Really? I thought that was an odd fit, but maybe it's just because they need help on the right side.
Yes. Yeah. And the other thing, Frank, that it makes sense for, like, with some of these guys, when you look at them, the cap space issue. Now, I know that you can kind of go three-way deals and such, but the thing about Phil Kessel is historically he's very good in the postseason, right? And the New York Rangers still are fairly overall inexperienced team come playoff time with their group of players. And Phil Kessel, it's funny. There's some people that try to. I think he's been given a real bad rap at times. Phil can be very laid back, and I don't think that's a negative thing. But man, lots of guys who play with him, lots of them really enjoyed playing with him. So I think he could easily fit in your room, which is one of the things that you've talked to a lot of people about over the years. Is when you get someone, do you think how quickly can they fit into your locker room? And the only thing about Phil is now he has a young baby. I would assume maybe his wife, girlfriend, they would move with him, right? When you got a youngster, anybody out there knows that, man, every week your young child can change so much. You don't want to be apart from them. So, but the Rangers, it's funny. That's who I had on my Arizona list because they make the most sense to me. They need a score on the right side. And Phil Kessel, I know he doesn't have the biggest numbers right now, Frank, but he's got more skill to play with in New York.
Yeah,
I think he could flourish there.
Yeah, he's just struggled to score. He's got 6 goals this year, on pace to be under 10. It's his worst productivity season. You mentioned the playoff success. I think that's why teams are interested. I also think it's not going to cost a lot to try and find out. So, maybe the Rangers have been mostly looking at guys with term because that's what makes sense. They've got tons of cap space to play with. I just don't see them being involved huge on the rental market because it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for them given where they're at.
Pittsburgh Penguins. What do you make of the Pens?
I think they're going to be quiet. I think they would have loved to have moved out Kasperi Kapanen to try and bolster their forward group. They'd like to add an additional shooter, scorer, winger. I don't see them being all that active.
Now, here's a name, Frank, because I think they need somebody to play with Evgeny Malkin, right? We just talked about Phil Kessel. Malkin and Kessel were a dynamic duo for the Penguins, a big reason why they won 2 cups. That's what I think they need. So if they're going to bring someone in, I think they need someone who they feel can play with Evgeny Malkin. Hard to find, but that's what I think they need. Like they don't have any glaring weaknesses on that team. Tristan Jarry's been unreal for them in goal. I think they need someone to play with Malkin.
I think they might sniff around on the backup goalie market. I don't think they're wowed with Casey DeSmith if Jarry gets to the playoffs again and can't find himself or suddenly loses his game, which is what happened last year. But I just don't see Pittsburgh being that active at all.
The Carolina Hurricanes, Frank. I know you have them. You don't think they're going to do much, and I could understand that. I think they need a different element in their forward group. I think they have a lot of forwards that are very the same. They're all good, but they're all similar type guys. Barclay Goodrow's name, it's an easy one to say because it worked, but I think they need that style of player for them. And a guy who maybe fits that bill is Nick Paul, right? If I'm Ottawa, though, I've said this on record. If I'm Ottawa, I would try to retain Nick Paul because then you're just going to spend years trying to find someone like him. But
he took another swing on Thursday.
Yeah, that's I would try to re-sign him if I'm Ottawa if I could. But that I don't know if Carolina will do anything, Frank, but I think they should. That's all I'll say.
I think they've tried. I think they've been in conversations. I think they've checked in to make sure that the prices are what everyone thinks that they are. But I think they really like their team. I think they look at their cap picture and know that they'd have to move someone out in order to make the money work. I don't think they're wild about that. They've been rolling along all season. And I don't know. I think they're looking, if their priority is anything, I think it's on defense. And I think it's to get a guy that has a little bit of bite, a little bit of edge to his game. Again, that provides a little bit of a different element. They have enough puck movers. They have enough excellent skaters. Slavin might be the best actual defenseman in the league. And we'll see. I think Sherratt was one of those guys that they had checked in on just to make sure that the price was still what a lot of teams felt was outrageous.
Yeah, a right defense is, I think, what they would look for. And you're right. There's not a lot of right D-men, Frank.
There's only 4 on our board.
Yeah, and so, but Justin Braun, if Justin Braun could fit in Carolina for a right defenseman, but you're right, he hasn't had a great year. That's the problem, and he doesn't have a ton of bite to his game, so he doesn't really fit that bill.